today why political rhetoric should be a resource for egalitarian politics, but instead is usually boring or obnoxious. I'm Cliff Mark, and this is Good in Theory. Rob Goodman, welcome to Good in Theory. You are a professor at Ryerson University, author of a book called Words on Fire, Eloquence and Its Conditions, and prior to that, a political speechwriter. Am I right?
Yep, that's correct. And thanks for having me on, by the way.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. We're glad to have you. So, tell me a little bit about this. I read a lot of academic stuff on, rhetoric, but tell me about your practical background, about the speechwriting part of it.
Yeah, well, I was a speechwriter on Capitol Hill for about 5 years. I worked on the House side and the Senate side. I worked for Chris Dodd in the Senate and Steny Hoyer, who's Nancy Pelosi's number two. Back then, I guess still is in the House. On a pretty steady basis. You'd write one speech or statement or press statement or floor statement or speech for an outside group, just maybe a couple per day. So you're churning out a really large quantity of words, on a kind of select number of themes because they each have their sort of pet issues every day. I was there in the late Bush years and the early Obama years. I think probably the highlight of being there in that period was being there during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, and getting actually to be on the House floor when the Affordable Care Act passed. That was a neat thing. I'm glad that
Nice.
I'm glad to in a teeny tiny way to have been part of that. So after about 5 years of that, I realized I was going to grad school part time. I was taking a part time master's course in philosophy and public policy at GW University in DC. Which sort of made me realize what I had really wanted to do was be an academic, and that I really missed that world. And kind of, I remembered a lot of that, taking some part-time courses, and I decided to make a change and get back into academia. So I went for my PhD at Columbia, and I studied political science and political theory. And as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to make the focus of my research and what I wanted to work on, I realized that there was a real opportunity here to connect what I had done in my past professional life to what I wanted to do as an academic, trying to figure out what my thing was going to be. Partly because I didn't want the time I spent doing rhetoric from the practical side to go to waste. I thought I could inform what I had to say about rhetoric and political theory in some unique ways that not a lot of people working in that area might have had the opportunity to do. There aren't a lot of opportunities to write in theory about something you've seen a little bit more up close in practice. So I like to think that what I'm doing when I think about rhetoric and political theory is at least a little bit informed by the time I spent in US politics, and that I can write about rhetoric and political theory with a little bit of the authority that comes from having done it, which I think mainly just means in practice that I try to be my own BS test. I try to think if what I'm talking about the theory of rhetoric and about the development of rhetoric over the long course of Western political thought, if it really makes sense to someone who's engaged in day-to-day practices of political persuasion, whether it's social media or speech writing or speech making or community organizing or whatever it is. I try to apply that test to the extent that I can, which I hope makes what I have to write more relevant to people in that world. Although I guess that remains to be seen. But at least that was what I was thinking when I tried to make that connection between what I had done as a professional and what I'm now trying to do as an academic.
Well, I think that's great, because it's not that many theorists have practical experience of any kind, much less of the thing they're theorizing, right? I mean, I did my dissertation was about honor and dueling, and I do not think that I lack dignity more than a regular human being. Right. I haven't fought any duels.
But there's still a chance. You still seem like a young guy. You never know, right?
Well, you can issue the challenges, but
yeah, I think I'm not an expert on this, but I think you need a glove. I wish I had a glove around here, but
yeah, they're great for throwing on the ground.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Your book, Words on Fire, Eloquence and Its Conditions, is about rhetoric. And I just want to start by specifying what you mean, because the word rhetoric could be used in a lot of contexts. You're talking about political rhetoric, and even political rhetoric, it could be in newspapers, in op-eds, in memes, on social media. It can be almost anywhere, but you're mainly concerned with the kind of paradigm type of political rhetoric. So you talk about Cicero a lot in the book. You can picture Cicero at the rostrum addressing the Roman people, trying to rile them up to do something. And if they like what he's saying, they'll cheer him and acclaim him. And if they don't, maybe they'll heckle him, throw cabbage. Maybe they'll assault him after. Bad things could happen. Now, traditionally, rhetoric of this kind of persuasive political speech, has been really important in politics and an important part of the gentleman's education. But in philosophy and in common thought, rhetoric's been suspicious, right? Because if these speakers, they're stirring up everyone's emotions, they're trying to get them to do something, why isn't it just manipulation? Shouldn't they be addressing the people's reason? So you don't think that rhetoric is bad this way. So tell me, why isn't rhetoric just manipulation? Why do you think it can play a positive role?
Yeah, so I think first of all, you're absolutely right that the kind of manipulative or emotionally manipulative speech you're talking about definitely exists. It absolutely is a thing out there in the world. And one of the things I'm concerned with in the book is trying to figure out why it happens and what we can do about it. But I will say that I tend to think of rhetoric on the whole as a good thing. And I guess the reason I do is because there isn't really any other means of making large-scale collective decisions. I think about rhetoric as a way of collective decision-making, as a way of trying to figure out what we in a given group are going to do. It has to do with judgment. It has to do with thinking together in public. And of course, there are bad ways of doing it. And of course, there are bad ways of thinking together in public, just as there are kind of dumb or fallacious ways of thinking as an individual. So I don't think that the existence of those means that the whole thing is kind of a doomed enterprise. But I do think that there are resources in the history of thinking about rhetoric that help us to try to have more of the good and less of the bad. One thing that I really take from Brian Garston, who wrote a really influential book on rhetoric that I draw from that really influenced me, called Saving Persuasion, is that when we're using rhetoric, we're trying to persuade people by starting with what they think and what they believe, and trying to get them where we want them to go. Trying to connect the belief that we're trying to inculcate with where they already are. But if you're taking that step, you're already showing a lot of regard for them as your fellow citizens, as potentially political equals, as people that you take seriously, because you have to take people's starting points and their beliefs and their values and their emotions seriously if you really want to have a hope of persuading them. So even though that there are plenty of forms of manipulative and anti-democratic rhetoric, I think the whole premise that you can use words to move people starts from a basic regard for the people you're dealing with. You can't even hope to succeed at rhetoric unless you have some kind of basic concern and care for the people in front of you. Of course, that can be distorted and manipulated in all sorts of ways, but I start from that basic concern and care.
Great. I want to follow that up a little bit, because I get the argument that in order to persuade people, you have to have some concern for what they care about and what will move them, and that's fine. And so even in order to make an appealing speech and a persuasive speech, you have to appeal to these things that they already care about. But my question is, if you care so much about the audience, then why don't you just tell them the facts and let them decide? Because the practice of rhetoric isn't just that, right? You talk about stylistic abundance. And I would say that if you give Cicero as an example, his speech is really extra. He's always adding in flamboyant examples and fancy language. And it's not just that, but as you know from Aristotle, persuasive speech isn't just about the argument. It's also about showing that you're a persuasive, trustworthy speaker. That's ethos. It's about the character of the speaker. And so in today's rhetoric, when people say, as a person of color or as someone with working class roots, politicians are saying this all the time. They're establishing their character, that they're a trustworthy person. And that doesn't always have to do with the facts of the case. And Aristotle is also saying that you have to appeal to the emotions. His guide to rhetoric is in large part about how to appeal to people's emotions. So the question is, if you care about your audience and you want them to have good decisions, why are you using all these persuasive techniques that go beyond just giving them a straight up argument, facts, reason that would allow them to make the best decision for themselves?
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason is the things that go into that quality of extra, like for instance, emotions or or ethos, the character of the speaker, how you show who you are in the way that you talk. I think Aristotle was right to say that these things aren't totally irrelevant, even if they're not part of an argument per se, because they tell us what we value about the world. They tell us they orient us to what's important. They orient us to whether we can trust this person speaking in front of us. And all these things are kind of beyond the level of the logical argument, but they still affect how we happen to judge as individuals. So I think part of the answer is sort of a realist answer, is that, like, look, this is just how we judge. We're emotional creatures. We have these emotions. We have these this wanting to evaluate people on the basis of their trustworthiness. You can you essentially can't get around it because that's how we are. But even beyond that, I think that there are one that our emotions and our evaluations of character kind of show what we value and what's important to us. And I also think that this, the stuff that goes in the category of stylistic abundance, the extra, the stuff in which orators actually kind of attempt to be eloquent, says a lot about how they're accommodating to that audience, because every audience that they talk to is going to have a different idea of what sort of language is appropriate, what sorts of figures of speech move them and don't move them, what counts as just the facts. I don't think there's this sort of like pre-political, pre-rhetorical, just the facts that are lying there you can pick up. I think you have to figure out what counts as that in any kind of given encounter with an audience. So I think that the number one reason that I think this stuff has been valued in the history of rhetoric, and why I continue to value it, is because a lot of it has to do with this value of a speaker accommodating an audience, a speaker learning about the people in front of him or her and demonstrating regard for them in the process of trying to win them over. And that's part of what makes rhetoric complicated, and that's part of what creates this sort of stylistic abundance. But I don't think it's just there for show or just there to make people sound pretty. I think it's there because it really comes out in the process of a speaker learning about what moves the audience and trying to reach an audience on the level of emotion and style and language and character, which matter whether we want them to matter or not.
So no matter what, we're doing rhetoric. There is no outside of rhetoric, so we might as well do it well.
I think that's fair to say. I think that, like I said earlier, I think there are kinds of forms of communication that aren't rhetorical. I think a conversation isn't like rhetoric for some interesting reasons. I think, geometry, logic, certain kinds of coming to arguments and demonstrating proofs aren't rhetoric in some interesting ways. But I think in general, when we're deliberating together about politics, we are doing rhetoric. And that means that our emotions that tell us what we value, whether it's our family or our home or our higher ethical values. Yeah, the big ones, right? Those are in there. And of course, there are manipulative ways to appeal to those, but there are also non-manipulative ways. And I think that just given that those appeals are going to exist in rhetorical speech, that's why it's kind of worth learning about how to do it well. And by well, I mean both kind of stylistically well and hopefully ethically well.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know. I sometimes get sick of hearing of hardworking Canadian families. But
we're all working so hard, right?
Sure. Right.
Yeah. Right. No, I know. But yeah, I hear you. Oh, that's another one. If you say I hear you or I get it, that's how a politician demonstrates their sympathy.
I hear you
for the working man.
See you.
Yeah. Message. I care.
Right. Exactly. So in the book, you talk about times when rhetoric goes well. It can realize these kind of egalitarian political goals, hopefully, so it's effective. It can be ethical. And You talk about this in terms of an interesting concept that you have called a rhetorical bargain. So, could you explain what the rhetorical bargain is and give us an example of rhetoric doing what it's supposed to do?
Yeah. So first, I think to explain this idea of a rhetorical bargain, I think it's basically the idea that, as I described it, especially coming out of the classical world, rhetoric is this asymmetrical situation. The few speak, the many listen. And from any kind of perspective interested in some kind of basic political equality, that's not ideal. That's not great.
Right.
You want to think of ways of potentially flattening that divide. You want to think of ways of potentially bringing some equity to an inequitable situation. And then the thing that I think emerges from people thinking about rhetoric under conditions of inequality, um, people like Cicero, who are not Democrats and not egalitarians, but still have some reasons to want the situation to be a little flatter, is this idea of a rhetorical bargain, this idea of risk on both sides of the equation, different kinds of risk that are appropriate to different places in the rhetorical situation. So I think for the audience, listening to something that might change your mind, exposing yourself to the possibility that you've been wrong, and you're going to renounce your past views on the basis of something you've heard. That's risky and it's potentially dangerous. It can upset your notion of who you are and what you value. For the speaker, I think there's a different kind of risk. It's this risk of being publicly rejected, of being humiliated, of losing face. For someone like
Mm-hmm.
Cicero, and this might connect with a little bit about what you've studied and thought about on the idea of honor. For someone in a society that highly values ideas of honor or virtus, which is connected to the ideal of manliness, losing face publicly is a big deal. And this is something an orator takes on and risks, or at least ought to risk, every time he or she speaks up in public.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, how the bargain ought to work. So one of the examples I think about in the book of this bargain going well is, of course, sort of the classic speech that everyone looks to in the ancient world is Demosthenes' speech on the crown, in which he's justifying this policy of resisting what he sees as the tyranny coming from Philip of Macedon and threatening to submerge Athens for all these years. Even though the policy's failed, he's still trying to defend it and sort of making this sort of heroic rhetorical last stand. And there's this moment that's called the Oath on the Heroes of Marathon that gets quoted in all these ancient rhetoric treatises and textbooks, and in the treatise on the Sublime, sort of the famous moment in this, in which he swears by all the dead Athenian heroes of the past that you, the current people of Athens, haven't done anything wrong, and that you've done the right thing even though your policy has failed, that you did what was right despite your failure. And so the reason this is interesting to me is, one, it's obviously a tremendously risky move for him, because he is invoking sort of the highest civic ideals, the sort of ultimate symbolism of the golden age of this democracy that is now past and gone, invoking it to defend his own failed policy. There's a possibility that this thing could have gone very badly, that he could have been booed off the stage, which oftentimes people are when they attempt something that is trying to venture into this territory of the sublime, of the kind of over the top and the excessive. There's also, though, I think it's a great example of the connection between rhetorical form and content. So this idea of the form that he's using, the figure of speech that comes into play there is the idea of an apostrophe, which in rhetorical theory means you're swearing by or invoking someone that's not present. It's often kind of considered, in ancient times, was considered sort of the height of the sublime, because you're calling on the gods or calling on the heroic dead to witness what's going on. So one, it's kind of a form that embodies this idea of sublimity. But two, it's directly connected to the idea that he thinks that the past Athenian heroes were worth swearing by, and this is an appropriate occasion to invoke them. So if he were to just say, without, as the person who wrote the treatise on the Sublime imagined, what if you had taken that part out? And what if he had just said kind of flatly, not I swear by them that you did the right thing, but they did the right thing and so did you. If you said it in a kind of more just the facts way. His interesting observation on this is that, well, it really wouldn't be just the facts anymore, because the implication would be that he really didn't mean it. If you said something that was that kind of that risky and that dangerous and that kind of striving for sublimity in matter-of-fact terms, it would kind of indicate that you didn't really believe what you were saying. It would indicate that your heart wasn't in it, and it was sort of a kind of transparent ploy. So there's a sort of connection, I think, between the necessary form and the necessary content. It's a kind of example of how form isn't this sort of extraneous thing that kind of sits on top of the meaning of our words. It's a way of expressing what we mean and how we mean it. And I think the reason this gets singled out by lots of ancient writers who think about eloquence is as just sort of this paradigm example of how you use the form of your words, not just to elicit an emotional response and get goosebumps, but how to convey a kind of set of complicated ideas that almost can't be expressed straightforwardly, because to express them straightforwardly would be to kind of miss out on the idea that you're trying to advance.
Right. Okay. Great. So there are important things that just matter of fact, plain language cannot express.
I think that's
you have to use you have to use rhetorical forms in order to get the job done.
I think that's fair to say, because I think there's the meaning of things isn't just kind of the straightforward semantic meaning. It's the kind of what it means for you and what it means for us in this situation. And there are some things that that you don't really mean unless you say them with the form that kind of matches the content. You could just think of you could tell a loved one that you love them, but if you're not making eye contact and you're saying it in a kind of sort of flat monotone way, and you're looking away and you don't actually mean it. It's not just the semantic content of the words; it's the way in which you express them that is part of the message that gets sent. And of course, I think rhetoric is all about finding much more complex ways than that form and content back each other up.
Okay. And so in that example, could you give us an explanation of it in terms of the rhetorical bargain that we were talking about that makes rhetoric a resource for egalitarian politics?
Yeah. So I think, part of the reason I look to the Roman situation for the rhetorical bargain is that I think it speaks a lot more to us, is that it's kind of an oligarchic republic rather than a direct democracy. But, in the Demosthenes situation, you're theoretically in a direct democracy in which kind of any Athenian male can get up and speak. In practice, though, it's kind of a limited number of people who have the ability, the training, the leisure, the recognition to get up and address the assembly. So despite the fact that you've got formal equality, you've still got some kind of informal inequality of who can speak. So the idea that Demosthenes is a trained, effective elite speaker from a wealthy family with rhetorical training means that he's kind of one of a few people, relative few people, who can regularly address the assembly. So that's part of the asymmetry that's based into it. It's not just the idea that he is speaking and maybe 10,000 or 5,000 or however many people are listening. It's that he's one of a smaller number of people who could potentially speak. So you've got the situation of asymmetry baked into it. So how do you bridge that a little bit? I think part of the way you bridge it is by saying that I, the person who am claiming the privilege to speak to you, am going to put some skin in the game. I'm going to accept a comparatively higher risk. So in his case, it's the risk of any particular kind of rhetorical gesture. Like I said, swearing on the dead heroes to kind of endorse your policy is such a risky move that if enough people didn't buy it, and of course these things there can be tipping points. If 50% plus one don't buy it, you could conceivably be laughed out, shouted down, heckled. That this happens all the time in the Athenian context. People are always shouting down, heckling speakers. He's giving this speech in a trial. So if he loses, there are potentially legal consequences, up to and including, I'm not sure what the stakes for him were in this particular case, but up to and including exile, heavy fines, worse. So in many ways, you're kind of pleading for your life. So these heavy penalties apply to the elite that don't apply to the average Joe or Demetrius or whoever it is in the audience. So what was the audience putting on this stake? I think they're putting at stake the smaller but still important risk of listening, of reevaluating what they had thought in terms of what they're hearing. In this case, Demosthenes is kind of arguing from a position of weakness because he had been associated with this exceptionally aggressive interventionist anti-Macedon policy that seems to be crumbling, that seems to lead to Athens losing its political independence. He's in trouble. And if you're an average member of the assembly that believes this, and you are still opening yourself up to the possibility that maybe you got it wrong and it might be otherwise, and you're willing to be persuaded, I think of that as a risk too, because it's a kind of risk to your integrity as a political person. It's a risk to your to the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you value in politics. It's not the kind of risk of getting exiled, but I think it's appropriate to put the bigger risk on the positions of bigger privilege, which is kind of what this rhetorical bargain does, for me.
Great example. And I like the example you brought up about, telling the different ways you can tell someone that you love them that might mean different things, right? And that same example would illustrate here the vulnerability of the speaker, because if you tell someone you love them and they throw cabbage at you and heckle you out of the assembly, well,
right.
it's not going to go well. There is a vulnerability there.
Right.
Can you give me an example of modern good rhetoric of eloquence? So people might talk about Martin Luther King or JFK or even Obama. Give me an example in living memory of modern day eloquence.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this, and actually,
I mean, if you want to tell me about one of your speeches, go right ahead.
No, mine are pretty forgettable. But there is an example that I didn't find a way to work it into the book, but it really kind of struck me as illustrating this kind of riskiness and how it plays out. Was the example of Emma González in the March for Our Lives, when one of the protests against gun violence that came out of the Parkland shooting in Florida. And I thought about this quite a bit as a modern example, because I don't really look to most mainstream politics as demonstrating eloquence in the way I think of it. For some of the reasons I talk about in the book, I think there are a lot of reasons that you don't see eloquence for the most part in the political mainstream, because there isn't much of an incentive or reason to pursue it, and there isn't much of a culture around it. So there's a lot of culture of risk avoidance, or a culture of demagogic speech that has its own problems. So I really think that for the most part, if you're going to look to speech in the tradition of eloquence, you need to look kind of outside the mainstream, on the margins, at protests or from civil society groups. So I think of Emma González at the March for Our Lives. Gets up to speak, and partway through her speech at this rally, goes completely silent, and remains silent for a number of minutes, until people are kind of uncomfortably shuffling around, wondering if she's lost her nerve, wondering if she's having a panic attack, wondering if she has a huge case of stage fright or something like that. Until finally, at the end of this time period, she reveals that she has been silent for the precise amount of time that the shooter in the Parkland shooting had carried out the mass shooting there. So this is really fascinating and interesting to me, and moving to me in so many different ways. So one is this kind of connection between form and content. We're totally desensitized at this point by the idea of a mass shooting. At least I think we are. And I think Emma González recognized that too. So what is another way to bring this home? What is a way to kind of bring to a mass audience some kind of the discomfort and wrongness and sense of fear that you might have gotten from living through a mass shooting? And part of that is figuring out a way to put that into oratory, to put that into words, because it's almost kind of conveying the sense that we are out of words to convey the horror of this, because this has been reported to death and spoken about to death. But there are some things that can only be represented by silence because they're that terrible. That's part of it. And the other thing that's interesting to me is this connection between risk and eloquence that I mentioned. That this is sort of especially for someone like her that doesn't really have much of a public profile, that isn't really at that point kind of known as a speaker, that is just a high school kid, is to take the risk of kind of breaking the form, in a sense, kind of taking the risk of not doing what she is expected to do, and risking that people will take it seriously, that she's been kind of struck by stage fright, or that she's been paralyzed by the inability to say anything about this, but really have it be a kind of a really deliberate, controlled gesture. And to be able to, I can only imagine being in that situation and coming up with this idea of how you want to represent this kind of empty, silent space at the center of this experience, and then going through with it, and looking as your kind of watch. Presumably she's kind of looking at a phone or a watch, it's kind of counting down the time, and going through with it for 1 minute and 2 minutes and 3 minutes, and holding on in this incredibly uncomfortable situation until she reaches the point at which she had exactly kind of mimicked the time period in which this life-changing event happened. she's a
And
student.
she's a student. She's not a
No,
professional
right. She
public
was someone
speaker.
who's a survivor of the shooting, and to kind of
Mm-hmm.
that's the sort of I can only imagine not just the experience of speaking in front of a crowd, but doing something kind of that unusual in front of a crowd, but that meaningful in front of a crowd is
Oh yeah.
part of the kind of this existential quality of uncertainty, discomfort that a good speaker ought to speak in the course of doing something scary and eloquent. Eloquence ought to be scary to the speaker and the audience. This quote that I made a chapter title, but I keep coming back to it when I think about Cicero's mentor explaining in his dialogue that whenever he gets up to speak, he trembles in his heart and in every limb. This idea that eloquence and trembling go together because you're really attempting something that is unusual and new and unique and frightening. And I think that public speech, for the most part, is so kind of stereotyped and stylized these days that there isn't a lot of opportunity for that. And this is one of the rare opportunities where I actually saw those qualities and can only imagine how it must have felt to kind of produce them in real time. So I wish I put that in the book, but I didn't find a good way to kind of connect that to the broader themes. But that's what I had in my mind as I was thinking about where do you find that these days? That was an example that stood out to me.
Great. That's really interesting. I think that, I mean, I'll get onto that, but I've heard speeches at, live political events I found quite moving. And that's typically not what I find when I'm watching television and seeing a high level politician speak. Which I'd like to, turn to now, because we've talked about examples of eloquence, of rhetoric going well, and there are a lot of complaints about contemporary political rhetoric, especially when you look more directly at how politicians are speaking and a little bit more about the broader discourse. But I think that contemporary political rhetoric is awful. I can't stand to watch politicians speak a lot of the time, and I'd like to just make some complaints about it, and you can tell me why you think it's that way. So one way that political rhetoric goes wrong these days, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, is that it is incredibly boring. It's bland. To take a local example from Canada, I cannot watch Justin Trudeau when he speaks. There are no thoughts that appear in my brain. I get a bit frustrated because he doesn't answer questions, but it seems like so many platitudes that I can't really, there's no edges that I can get a grip on what people are saying. And one of the examples of the same kind of thing you talk about in your book, I think, is Hillary Clinton talking about America is great, and we're great because we're good, and we're good because everyone knows it, and we're going to value all our diversity, and yada, yada, yada. And it's just kind of a word salad that means nothing. So it's bland. Let's start with that. Why are politicians who, if we have any education in ancient Greece, we think they should be standing up, setting the rostrum on fire. Their job is at least part public speaking, and yet they're reading total platitudes from a sheet as though they're the first speech they made of their life. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, what is going on with that? I was thinking about the Justin Trudeau example. I've since moving here, I've been exposed to my fair share of Justin Trudeau rhetoric. I think the only I was thinking, like, what's the most memorable Justin Trudeau quote of the entire kind of prime ministership? And I think it must be when he said it's 2015 to talk about the gender balanced cabinet, which is great, but also like the prime minister's most meaningful statement was just kind of stating what year it was, which is just like remarkable that it's been that many years. And that's the only Justin Trudeau quote I can remember. But yeah, so I support you on that. And I guess, so what is it? I think there are a lot of reasons. But I think part of it, I think kind of the heart of this is that there's a lot more to lose than there is to gain with kind of, any extremes of eloquence or any kind of quality of extraordinary speech. And part of that is that the way that politics has changed, that in any kind of legislative debate, for instance, politicians don't go to the floor of Parliament or of Congress to change minds, because their responsibility is to their party and maybe to their constituents and their voters. But they don't go in with the kind of mandate where they are willing and able to respond to persuasion. And of course, if people aren't going to respond to persuasion, then you won't try to persuade them. I think that's part of the reason why there isn't a lot of eloquence in legislative bodies. But I think in general, um, I think the reason there isn't a lot of political eloquence from politicians more broadly is because, like I said, um, if eloquence is closely tied to risk, um, there's very little reward that justifies those kinds of risks. I don't think, for instance, Hillary Clinton um, lost because she was a risk-averse speaker. Justin Trudeau's been pretty politically successful as an extraordinarily risk-averse speaker, um, and I think that in addition to the kind of changing risk reward calculus, now there are so many more tools than there ever have been in the past for politicians to pursue this kind of the quality of what I borrow a term in the book to call algorithmic rhetoric that kind of responds to quantifications of what they expect the public is going to accept. And I think part of the reason it doesn't strike people as especially new or risky is because, to the extent possible, it's calculated to be a speech that they're already going to kind of nod along and agree with. It's not really going to challenge people because you've already done the work of figuring out what people want to hear.
Right.
Yeah, so I think part of it is technical change, part of it is institutional change, but I think part of it is, and I struggle to kind of come up with a better way of expressing this, but when rhetoric is first developed as a discipline, it's a discipline both of speech and discipline of character formation, of training. The idea that someone would want to pursue a certain kind of way of speaking to demonstrate their their virtus or their virtue in the public sphere, um, is ultimately, I think, kind of a character-driven pursuit. And I think it's kind of it's difficult. I don't like people kind of hand waving at kind of a virtue or character of ways of getting politicians to do what we want them to do, because it's really hard to institutionalize that. It's really hard to think about that in systemic terms. But I guess what I come down to is that our political culture doesn't really value eloquence and oratory and the orator as a distinctive and kind of unique public figure. And so we don't get that because there's no value to public figures kind of pursue and fill and act out that kind of role. It's not as if they've lost the ability to pursue this kind of speech. It's just that they have no kind of motivation, either internal or external, to want to pursue it.
I really like that idea of algorithmic rhetoric. Political rhetoric is getting routinized. Politicians use all these techniques. They do polls, they do focus groups, and all their messaging. Mm-hmm. And by the time the politician gets up to speak, they're just feeding back what they know the public wants to hear. They've flattened everything out. Mm-hmm. But that still doesn't quite give the answer for why it has to be boring, right? Why is the main incentive to not mess up or to lose anyone rather than to inspire some people? Mm-hmm. I mean, people do the same thing with Hollywood movies, right? And they're sometimes able to make stuff that people care about or can at least sit through for many hours rather than a few minutes.
Right. So why is the incentive to not mess up? I think just because the costs of messing up in any one case can be tremendous. They can be, I think that this is the thing that Cicero thinks about, that they could be career ending. In his case, it could be, they could lead to actual physical harm. Not all politicians face that these days. They certainly do kind of take their careers in their hand when they speak. So I think in any given circumstance, the benefit of doing something inspiring just seems to be so much smaller than the risk of saying the wrong thing and ending a career. I don't like to invoke cancel culture because that's just kind of totally stripped of meaning. But you have a lot of, I think it kind of speaks to the sense, at least among kind of political and cultural elites, that if they say the wrong thing, the consequences are so much worse than the benefit of them saying the right thing. And this kind of results in kind of less risky speech. I think the flip side of that is that in the kind of paradigmatic ancient cases I talk about, you still have speakers facing tremendous consequences. Cicero wouldn't worry about getting canceled. He would have worried about getting, physically attacked, and ultimately he was assassinated for his political words, right? So it's not as if risks didn't exist then. It's that there was something impelling political figures, I think, to go towards those risks. There was something in kind of impelling them to take on risks as a demonstration of who they were and what their character was. It doesn't mean they're kind of better and more virtuous leaders than the ones we have now. It just meant that there was some kind of social or cultural or political pressure they faced to do riskier things that came at higher costs of failure. And I think part of that came from the outside. It came from sort of populist bottom-up pressure from people who were competing in the same political space. Part of it came from um, this sort of difficult, and to a Roman, it would have been sort of an counterintuitive claim that you can demonstrate virtus, this quality of manliness, by the way that you speak. Well, how is that? Well, it's by taking on tremendous kind of burdens and risks in the way that you speak that are kind of analogous in the Roman mind to, the really manly things like going off to war.
Right.
I think
so. Saying things that everyone will accept is just boring and not manly or virtuous.
Right.
Whereas going out there and really putting it on the line with like a bold point of view is actually an accomplishment that we might admire.
I think so, and I think part of the reason that eloquence changes, and I talk about this a little bit at the conclusion of the book, is that most of the eloquence that is kind of forms the kind of Western rhetorical tradition comes out of this really kind of circumscribed world of a bunch of elite males doing status competition. It comes from a very kind of circumscribed, limited world in which you can win elite virtus credentials, whether you're in the 18th century British Parliament or in the first century BC Roman Forum, by taking on rhetorical risks and by putting it on the line. So, naturally, our culture doesn't and should not think of public speech in the same way. There's a lot more at stake than which particular elite male gets kind of manliness points.
Right.
But I think that the side effect of losing that culture, the side effect of losing the impetus to push elites to take risk in their speech is a much more cautious and risk-averse kind of way of speaking. So I think in the way I kind of leave it in the book, and maybe this is the next book, I don't know, I don't have a good answer to this right now, but where I leave it is it's important for us as a political culture to come up with ways of pushing elites towards political risk and towards risky, difficult, dangerous speech for the reasons I talk about these things being valuable, without trying to recreate this rightfully and thankfully vanished culture of elite male status competition. How do you get the benefits of that kind of culture without the kind of baggage that it came with? And this is
I like rivalry and macho posturing as much as the next guy, but I mean, I don't like. The more you talk about it, I'm not sure that's something I want to organize politics around, right?
Yeah.
So it may be that if really what this is about not about kind of evening hierarchical divides and really getting a sense of what the people need, and then holding leaders and speakers accountable by making them undergo risk. If it's really just riskiness for the sake of showing off, then I'm not so sure I'm persuaded that eloquence and rhetoric is a great idea and can serve democracy that well anymore.
Yeah,
and go on.
Yeah, so I've thought about that too, and I think that's something I've struggled with. I guess where I come down is that I try to distinguish between, you mentioned like for the sake of and the side effects of. And I guess when I think about, I come back to Cicero because I think he developed a lot of these ideas or at least wrote them down. I think he pursues a certain kind of idea of eloquence for the sake of winning kind of macho points, of kind of demonstrating his virtues. The side effect of this, I think, is that he flattens a rhetorical situation and celebrates the ability of the crowd to push back and take a vocal role in rhetoric, not because he's a Democrat, not because he sympathizes with them, not because he wants a flatter politics, but because he sort of has to in order to have kind of a worthy adversary against which to demonstrate his virtues. So, you kind of what I like is the side effect. I think this is the sort of thing where the pursuit of a bad thing leads to a good side effect. And I'm trying to, I try to leave it in the book is, well, how can we kind of pursue this thing that flattens situations of public speech and public persuasion without the same kind of motivation that no longer exists and really shouldn't exist. And that's still a puzzle to me, but I don't want to write off the side effects and the results of this just because the motivations that get us there are things that I personally, and you presumably too, don't really like.
Oh well, look, I'm an honor guy,
Yeah, right.
so showing off is fine with
Right.
me, right? Recognition is a totally legitimate motivation, especially when others might not be available.
Right.
But one other reason that I want to float why the fact that political rhetoric right now is so boring might actually be a good thing is this. A lot of the best speeches seem to come out of very dramatic, chaotic, risky situations, right? So you think of Winston Churchill, fight them on the beaches speech, something like that, or Demosthenes' speech. These are crisis situations where like there's a lot going wrong. Maybe the reason political rhetoric is so boring is because politics is going pretty well. There's no giant disruptions or risk. It's stable. All the things that we ought to be mad about are not necessarily the crises, but just the slow, ongoing structural evils of our political situation. So maybe boring speech just means boring life, and boring life is overall better. Like may we live in boring times, right?
Right. And that's totally, that critique has been around for a long time. That's what Tacitus, or at least one of the characters that he wrote in The Voice of, said, is that, he says rhetoric. I think the famous quote is that great oratory is like fire. It feeds on things it's burning. The more that it's burning, the brighter the flame is. So when your house is on fire, that provokes eloquence about it. I was thinking about when you talk about the kind of grinding structural problems we can't solve. I just watched Don't Look Up on Netflix a few days ago, and I think a lot of people did. And I was thinking a lot of people have kind of critiqued this by saying it's supposed to be this global warming allegory. And yet global warming, climate change isn't like a comet striking the Earth at all. It's not this kind of like deadline thing where the clock is ticking down. It's this kind of boring, structural, systemic thing that is not going to change noticeably in anyone's lifetime, which is what makes it so devilishly hard to deal with. So yeah, that is like, how do you maybe problems like that and times like this, even like the pandemic, don't produce great oratory. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think one of the things I talk about in the book is Edmund Burke's response to this, is his critique of this position, that struck me as having a lot of plausibility, which was that sometimes the relationship can go the other way around, because language itself is powerful. Sometimes the right kind of language can wake us up in a situation in which we've kind of been numbed or kind of lulled to sleep by the non-dramatic nature of our problems, and that sometimes language that is has this quality of sublimity, which is this kind of quality of striking fear into people, or over the topness, and not kind of fear of not kind of fear of personal danger, but awesome in the sense that kind of awesome originally meant. Rhetoric that is sort of deliberately awe-inspiring, at least in the way that Burke thought about it, can wake people up to look at their situation they're in more clearly, because sometimes you can kind of get in a destructive cycle in which events are boring, so speech around them is boring, and people kind of get lulled to sleep and they can't deal with the crisis that arrives in their events because they're kind of asleep. And Burke's thinking around language at least, was the idea that language itself can sometimes take priority, that the right kind of pursuit of sublimity can shake people up so much that they sort of kind of sit up in their seats, so their vision is clarified, that they look at political events with a new kind of sense of perception and clarity, and can judge where they are a little bit better. And I don't know if that's kind of, I think that's an empirical question as much as a theoretical question. But to the extent that kind of the Tacitean speculation about this is also theoretical, what if boring times lead to boring rhetoric? I think it's kind of fair to respond to it with another what if question, which is, what if language can have priority sometimes and can wake us up when we've been too bored to respond to the problems in front of us?
Right. Well, I mean, those are two distinct cases, right? Because maybe I muddied the waters by throwing in the grinding structural problems. But there's one thing to say, look, we want boring politics. Exciting politics are bad because people are usually dying.
Right.
And therefore, if the cost of it is that we have boring rhetoric, fine.
Right.
But then there's a separate point that you're making that I also think is really interesting and quite plausible, which is that when there are real problems that people are asleep to, rhetoric may be the way to wake them up.
Right. I see what you mean.
And maybe we need some excitement when there is a de facto crisis that people are not noticing.
Yeah.
But that's more of identifying it. you
Yeah.
know?
So I think in the first case, you're talking about kind of the which is kind of the more challenging response is like the boring times, boring speech, everything's great. And I think that's fair. I guess the only
Well,
kind of,
I mean, isn't that what we wanted modern government to be?
yeah, I mean, right. That's sort of
So
right.
we don't want this this fickle Athenian mob going left and right, making all these decisions, going to war for glory, etc. It was let's do a cost benefit analysis. Let's do that in committee. Let's analyze it and then just explain the facts to people. And no quick turns.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason to get everyone standing up. A standing ovation is probably a sign people are not doing things at the right pace.
Yeah, that's sort of the Enlightenment dream, right? That's the sort of Hume essay that politics may be reduced to a science. That's sort of the goal of that kind of school of thought. And I guess the way I think about it is I think that's it's good in theory to take the turn of the podcast. I think that kind of in theory makes sense, but I also think that when you talk about boring politics, it always raises for me the question of boring to who. It's always that
Right.
boring in whose terms. I would say that even in situations in which politics are kind of normal and technocratic and ordinary and not dramatic, there are still power differentials. There are still haves and have-nots. There's still winners and losers. There's still justice and injustice. And politics, I think, can be very outwardly boring, maybe because you live in kind of a sort of ideal state of good government, or maybe because you kind of live in a state of ideological hegemony, and that the powers that be have so much control over the ideological apparatus and are so good at generating consent that there isn't really a challenge to um, their priorities and their sense of what makes politics boring. I think about, I go back to the original way that Tacitus raised this point, and this is kind of why I attributed it to the guy in the dialogue rather than Tacitus himself, because there's a lot of like, did he really mean this? Was he speaking in someone's mouthpiece? Supposedly Tacitus is a guy who hated the Roman Principate, who hated the empire, who wanted to return to republican politics, and has this guy in the dialogue say, well, now that we have kind of the wisest citizen in the state running things, now we have administration rather than politics, things are boring, and it's good that speech isn't exciting because those were the bad old times in the Civil War, which is tough because on the one hand, it has a flavor of plausibility, but on the other hand, the politics he's describing as boring is the politics of kind of domination by the emperor and his household, is the politics of I think Tacitus also wrote this kind of famous line that they create a desert and they call it peace. It's this idea that you can have boring, peaceful politics because your government is so good that no one has an objection, or also because the kind of domination of the ruling class is so complete that no one thinks to raise an objection. And I get
the silence of despotism.
Yeah, and it's hard to say which situation you're in. Certainly that's not what the kind of Enlightenment critique of rhetoric was aiming at. But I also think that it's hard to tell from within a moment of boring politics whether politics is, whether it's boring for reason A or boring for reason B. I say that as someone who grew up in the '90s, at a time of kind of the
the famously boring end of history.
Yeah, exactly. Which turned out not to have been. Right. Yeah. Which makes you wonder what kind of boring were we living through.
Yeah. So enough about boring rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to talk. I brought that up by saying that there's a few ways that contemporary political rhetoric seems to be going wrong. And the other big one is there's a lot of complaints, not about boring establishment rhetoric, but about insurgent populist rhetoric. So there's a lack of decorum. There's an end of civility. You've got Trump making fun of people and throwing insults around. People are willing to say things that they wouldn't say before. People are getting, speaking in very conversational, not stylized terms. So there's this other critique of political rhetoric that's, I think, talking about a completely different kind of rhetoric. So why do we have that trend as well right now?
I think we have it in kind of a response to the kind of pathologies of establishment or mainstream rhetoric that I've been talking about, the kind of pathologies of risk aversion, because I think that the one thing that stands out to me about the kind of populist Trumpian, to take a kind of clear example, rhetoric, is the appearance of um, uh, risk acceptance, the appearance of tremendously dangerous speech that could supposedly sink this guy at any kind of given moment. This is sort of the reason that I think that back when he was first getting on the national stage as a presidential candidate in 2015, 2016, anytime Trump opened his mouth, every network would cut to him, because the presumption was that
he'd say something fun to watch.
yeah, it's going to be fun to watch, and he's going to put his foot in it. And he's going to say something that's going to be so bad it's going to destroy his career. We're all going to watch this happen in real time, and it's the kind of tightrope walk of watching it happen. But I think the problem is that with hindsight, it's turned out that a lot of this appearance of you're right, of walking the tightrope, is that there's very clearly a net like 1 foot below the tightrope, which is that he's not really taking on those risks. He's speaking to audiences that are primed to agree with him. He quotes, he has so many scandals at the same time that nothing exactly breaks through. And also, I think I say this in the book, but when I say that he's incapable of shame, I'm not saying this that he's a bad and unvirtuous person. I'm saying that shame is an important part of public speech, and that it kind of means you're responding to negative feedback from the audience. If you don't have that stimulus, if you can't feel that, like someone might not be able to feel pain because they have
So
nerve damage.
Demosthenes, he was trembling in his heart and in every limb because he had a strong sense of shame. If he got booed, he would have been mortified.
Right, he would have
and
felt
it might have been career-ending.
Right.
Whereas Trump, he gets booed, he loves it, and his support just becomes stronger.
Exactly.
So the incentives are all...
Yeah. And I think he responds to maybe boos from his kind of particular audience. He kind of courts his for his base. But I think there are other people that simply don't have kind of standing to object to him as a political figure. So really, like the risk that he takes on in any given appearance, it seems enormous at first glance. In reality, I think not so much. So I think it kind of gives the appearance of what we actually would like rhetoric to look like. So when I think about why do people connect with figures like him, I think it's because they seem like they are offering something that we are missing, even though they aren't really doing that. But I think that they are filling, they're meeting a real need. The need is out there. They're just kind of meeting it in kind of a cheap sort of fast food way to kind of mix my metaphors.
Right. Okay, so we have Trump and different other sort of demagogic type speakers because mainstream political speech is too boring. It's just platitudes. It's already been focus grouped to death. We're not hearing anything there. So someone comes on, they're saying things that sound risky, but you're saying, people are looking for that risk, but there's actually no risk at all, so it's not what it looks like. I want to put to you a different reason. It's not so much... so why is it about risk? So for me, I will read Trump's tweets or watch him speak for pure entertainment value more than I would most other politicians. I would rather watch Joe Biden speak off script and spin me a yarn about life in the 50s or than watch him speaking from the teleprompter. I'd rather watch Rob Ford, to take a local example, than his brother Doug Ford as premier.
Right.
Because he's going to say something that doesn't sound completely scripted when the script writers, no offense, are writing really boring material. So is the appeal of Joe Biden mumbling a yarn really that people think he's going to fall on his face and ruin his career? Or is it just more interesting to hear? Same with Trump, because after a while, everyone saw the trick. No one thought that him being shocking was ever going to ruin his career. That's what had made his career. So there's a little more to it than we just need to see people take risks, isn't it?
I think that's fair to say. I don't, maybe I'm exaggerating when I'm saying that the costs of Trump doing something badly are going to ruin his career, because obviously, we've been through many years of this and he has not said the career ruining thing. I mean, he he tried to overthrow the government. He's the leading Republican nominee in the next election, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that maybe that's not the right way to put the kind of downside risk in the terms in which to put the downside risk. But I still would say that part of the interesting thing, at least speaking intuitively, watching Joe Biden tell that yarn or watching kind of Trump do one of his kind of free form riffs, um, yeah, is this idea that it kind of it's just this quality of spontaneity. So you don't know where it's going to go. It could pay off tremendously. It could have a great kind of ending or a punchline. Um, it could end up it could just end up going badly and giving you kind of that sense of aesthetic cringe. Um, it could end up embarrassing the speaker. It might at the extreme end his career. It probably won't in any given instance. But I do think that there's kind of that sense of unpredictability that includes consequences and sanctions for the speaker. Um, that most mainstream political speech is sort of designed from the standpoint of avoiding, that it kind of starts in that
Uh-huh.
standpoint and works backwards. I think that the standpoint that I think mainstream political speech starts from is um, what words work. What does the audience want to hear? What words move the lever or press the button that results in the political result I want with the smallest cost to me? What are they? And now I'm going to go out there and say them. So I think that the whole performance is kind of given um, you know, you from the perspective of the opposite of spontaneity, from the opposite of um, from a position of trying to maximize certainty for the speaker rather than trying to maximize interest and engagement from the
Mhm.
people listening. I think that that's why a lot of people have talked about Trump, for instance, as a humorist, or talked about his kind of the connection between demagogic power and joking and humor. I think one of the things that makes humor work in general is that it's unexpected. Punchlines are surprises. They're when statements go in directions you're not expecting, and they
Mhm.
kind of trigger your flight or fight response, and then they get resolved in a way that makes you laugh. At least that's kind of one theory of what humor does, the kind of incongruity idea of humor. Um, and I think you can kind of generalize that to say that part of what makes this kind of non-mainstream or non-scripted, or even if it's Joe Biden kind of rambling speech, is this quality of unpredictability, which includes the possibility of it going badly for the speaker. But even if it doesn't go that badly, even if kind of Joe Biden kind of um, rambles on and embarrasses himself, isn't going to end his career, still might make him look kind of like a bit kind of doddering out of it, or in Trump's
Uh-huh.
case, um, look as if he said something kind of with this utter sense of shamelessness. Um, in either case, I still think that there's a kind of quality of putting more on the line than the ordinary speaker kind of wants to put on the line.
Uh-huh. And to say something about shamelessness, yes, Trump is shameless in what he'll say, but I think there's also a certain kind of, if you think putting it on the line by saying what you think is something worthy of respect, then there's a certain kind of shamelessness to be willing to get up on a speech and get up, before a crowd and read a speech of statements that have been focus grouped just because you think that people will like to hear them, to try
Uh-huh.
and press buttons in that way. That's like utterly shameless from a certain point of view, as well.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think so. I think that makes sense.
Um, okay, so we've talked about two ways that contemporary rhetoric is going badly. One is that established rhetoric can be incredibly boring. Two, that there's this other kind of rhetoric that people seem to be really interested in, is more entertaining, but um, nonetheless uh, isn't giving us what we want from rhetoric, and also might be damaging civility and decorum. Um, what would it take to have good rhetoric or eloquence now, and do we want it?
Hmm. Do we want it? Well, I think we do want it to the extent that we are still in a situation in which politics is asymmetrical, in which few speak and many listen. To the extent that that's the way that our politics is, to the extent we live in, Jeff Green talks about politics and spectatorship. To the extent that we are, uh, as ordinary people, in many ways spectators to politics and not actual political actors, I do think we want our politics to be um, more unpredictable, more kind of shaped by rhetorical risk, and therefore kind of more eloquent because of the side effects I talk about, which kind of tend in the direction of political equality, I think. Um, but how do we get there? Well, that's tough. I think that one thing I'm trying to develop in my next um, um, in my next project, which I'm still I'm still trying to figure out, but is the way in which a lot of the Ciceronian ideas of rhetorical risk that I talk about in this book are developed in response not just to kind of this argument within the Roman elite, but in response to pressure from the bottom up. So that tells me something that it's not politicians spontaneously deciding that they want to be more risky, or spontaneously deciding they want to pursue eloquence, or spontaneously developing the virtue to pursue it. It's that these things develop when there are publics who demand it. These things develop when there is a public demand for politicians to behave in a certain kind of way. So I guess that tells me, no, I don't have an answer to how this is going to happen, right? Because if I did, I'd be doing it instead of writing about it, right?
Yeah, and I might say that the way you get publics who will make these demands
is to write
or
about
to have publics who like have some kind of institution to make themselves heard.
Yeah, sure. And I think that eloquence happens when publics place a value on eloquence. I think Ciceronian eloquence develops in a context of bottom up pressure. And I guess what I'm writing about, hopefully in my next book, is about hopefully about race in American oratory, and the way these kind of questions about eloquence and access to the public sphere develop when people from oppressed groups, and especially here I'm thinking about Black orators in the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, claim the right to be heard in the public sphere in a way they hadn't previously been heard before, and how this changes the way the public thinks about eloquence. But that's a whole other project. But I guess my point is that if anything is going to change this, it's going to be because there's public pressure on politicians to be less predictable for reasons of promoting more equity in political communication, more equity in politics. Is it going to happen? Who knows? But I do think that it's not going to happen spontaneously because politicians suddenly decide that they want to start sounding more Ciceronian or Kennedy-esque or whatever it is.
Well, when we spoke a little earlier about the different contexts they have in which to speak, or if you even think about the career trajectory of a contemporary politician, eloquence doesn't seem to matter that much. I mean, it did kind of for Obama. He gave a famous speech, and then, he was kind of a big prospect to be the presidential candidate. But, I mean, what's the path to becoming an MP, right? And then what's the path to getting into cabinet? And then what's the path to becoming leader? It's not generally through speech making. And once you are in office, as you said, speeches on the legislative floor, on parliament floor, they're not going to persuade anyone. If anything, they're for sound bites for television. So maybe people who have independent, if they're going out and doing rallies with their supporters, that's an occasion maybe for rhetoric. But even then, the chances are you're giving it to supporters. They're not going to boo you. So it just seems that there's not even many contexts. Even if a politician wanted to be more eloquent, where would they get the practice? It's not part of their life the way it was in Greece or in Rome.
Right. And I think that, I think the way you describe it makes a lot of sense to me, is this idea that you could think of it as kind of like a satisficing thing in the political culture you're talking about. There might be a kind of minimal bar that you have to clear. You can't make an ass for yourself. You have to be able to string sentences together. But I think few people, you think about Obama as maybe a partial exception, but few people kind of ascend to political office on the strength of that, simply because that's not what our political system selects for or values. So is that a good thing? Are we selecting for other good things that we like instead of that? I mean, maybe, but I think that, I guess part of the case I'm trying to make in the book is that when you stop selecting for this, when you stop paying attention to this as something that a public figure ought to cultivate and develop, you lose out on things as well. And I think part of what you lose out on is the ability to kind of engage the public from a bit more of a perspective of equals, to treat them with that kind of regard and respect that takes their views seriously, which is, I think, kind of what rhetoric is all about. So it's, a lot of people think of eloquence as kind of a way of dominating, of generating ascendancy over the people you're listening to. But I really think about it in different terms. I think about it as caring enough about the individuality of the people you're speaking to try to impress them, to try to win them over, to try to create some kind of degree of beauty in public life.
If you're not trying to win them over, that means you don't really care what they think.
Yeah, I think so. And or you care what they think to the extent that you can kind of instrumentalize it, that you can kind of figure out what they think beforehand and then deliver, the words that you think are going to work. But again, that's not, that's the kind of thing that if we saw it in interpersonal relationships, we would think of it as sort of, tremendously manipulative or instrumentalizing. Imagine that, I'm sure people do this. You get matched with someone on a dating app, and imagine that you then, kind of use an algorithm to figure out exactly what kind of conversation topics they would like, and then drop them into conversation. If you did that in an interpersonal relationship, I think you'd be a creep. But I think that this is essentially what a lot of political communication boils down to. And I think, because we have a political culture in which the tradition of eloquence doesn't really get valued in the way that I've described, I think you have politicians who are much more inclined to instrumentalize the public. So again, I think eloquence is intrinsically valuable because it's aesthetically beautiful to me. It's important to me to have a public sphere in which we have aesthetic values that are recognized in the way we talk and comport ourselves. But even if you write that off, I think that the pursuit of it has some kind of valuable knock-on political side effects of the kind that I've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would love to be interested when I hear politicians speak as well.
Yeah. Or maybe not. Maybe it means we're heading towards doom. Right.
Right. Yeah. Or, maybe the fact that things are so boring now means that there's big opportunities for people who do move towards eloquence. And this might be what it took, that anyone who speaks at all well will stand out so much that there might be some incentives for it now.
Possibly, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on, Rob Goodman. Thanks for writing the book, Words on Fire, Eloquence and Its Conditions. Is that right?
That's right.
And that comes out this year, or is it?
It came out just a few weeks ago.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So anyone who is interested in the conversation, go have a look for it wherever you get your academic tomes. Thanks a lot for being on, and hope to hear about your next project.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thanks for a great talk.
Today, I want to send a big shout out to my man, Ethan Denny. Congratulations on absolutely killing it in your first philosophy course ever. And also, thank you for deciding to support us on Patreon. We hope we're of some use to you. If you, dear listener, would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/goodintheory, rate and review the show on your podcast app, grab someone else's phone, and subscribe to Good in Theory so they can enjoy it too. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.